Great. Good afternoon, everyone. And it is a pleasure to be the advisor for both of the students presenting today. They have very different topics, but it's definitely been an interesting experience to have the two different fields at the same time. Rachel will start us off here with her thesis, College Transitions, Comparing and Analyzing First-Year Experience Programs in Institutions of Higher Education. Rachel has produced a really wonderful project. It's a qualitative analysis. She had to conduct interviews and really work hard to code and interpret some of those underlying messages that were in her interviewees' responses. And you probably thinking, what? Wait a minute, Dr. Pometessa, she's a historian. I am, but I'm a historian of higher education. So I do have a background in all things higher ed. And so it was really cool to actually get to work with Rachel on this side of my field. So it was a wonderful experience. She did an awesome job. I'm really excited for you guys to be here today to hear her presentation. She did present this paper or her thesis at the let's see. I'm gonna forget all the Snickers monikers, but the State of North Carolina Undergraduate Research Symposium. Does that sound like I got it? Yeah. Okay. Yeah. In Wilmington in the fall, and she did an excellent job then, but that was before it was all complete, and now it is complete. So you guys are in for a treat. Maybe we'll learn something about first-year experience programs and maybe get some ideas for Greensboro College. Okay. I'll turn it over to Rachel.
Thank you for your introduction. Hi, everyone. My name is Rachel. Am I good right here, Dr. Plum? Okay, thank you. So as Dr. Pometessa mentioned, my thesis is called College Transitions, Comparing and Analyzing First-Year Experience Programs in Institutions of Higher Education. So to start off with, I have a little background information for you guys. So psychologically, college is a transitional time for students. So a typical college student will graduate from high school at age 18 and go straight into college. That's how the typical student does it. And this instantly becomes a transitional time for them because they're leaving that structured level of high school where you have your assigned classes and then you go home and typically live with your parents or guardians or someone who tells you kind of what to do. And then you move into college where you get to pick your own classes and you're not in class for 6-7 hours a day and you get to make your own schedule. So already this is a very different time for students. And that's part of what first year experience is for, is to guide students through that transition and to make that transition really easy for them. And another thing, the modern first year experience program is first seen in the early 1970s at the University of South Carolina. So this is a relatively new program or idea in higher education. Higher education has been around for hundreds and hundreds of years, but first year experience has only really been around since the early 1970s. And at the University of South Carolina, this originated because students and the faculty and administration at this specific school were kind of on edge and against each other. So there were student protests going on at this time, and there ended up being riots, and the president of the institution actually ended up locked in their office with like students outside the door. So the president was like, hey, we need to do something about this. And this was something that caused the first University 101 class to be developed. And I would compare that to our modern GCS class that all of you students had to take your first year here. It was a class to really allow the students and the faculty and administration to really get to know each other and come to a piece together, and for students to get to know the institution as a place where they can grow and develop rather than just a place where they get their learning from. And so that's one part of a typical first year experience program, but the typical program also consists of typically a summer orientation type thing. So that can be compared to Greensboro College's PAWS orientation. So where students come to the institution over the summer, learn about the school and what college is really like. It also sometimes has a welcome week, which is something usually before classes or around the first week of classes where students do programming and really try to bond together first year students after they move in to really instantly get them connected to the university. And also, first year advising is sometimes included in this as well. So this is more on the academic side of first year experience. So you get to pick your classes, figure out what you're majoring in, and really determine academically what you want to do. And the first year class is something I already mentioned, like the University 101 class at the University of South Carolina, or compared to our GCS class here. And lastly, interdepartmental programming. So oftentimes first year experience is its own department in a university. It's not always called that, but there's something that is really similar to that. But a lot of times this department works with other departments on campus to create programming for first year students. So on the academic side, they can work with tutors or academic advising, or on the student event sides, they can work with student activities to really bring those students into the university. So it's kind of an overview of what first year experience is as a whole. And now we're going to look at my specific research questions for this project. So my first question are, what are the goals and expectations of an institution's first year experience program? How do these goals support the overall mission of an institution? And how does each institution measure the effectiveness of first year experience? And lastly, is there a correlation between institution type, student demographics, and the effectiveness of first year experience? So how was I going to do all of that? So I interviewed 6 different universities and asked them, I think, 8 or 9 or 10 questions relevant to my research questions. And since I was interviewing real people at real institutions, I did keep all of their information coded. So I coded them through these descriptor words here. So I interviewed a small private institution, a large state institution, an HBCU, community college, a prestigious private institution, and an affluent private institution. And here you can kind of see some of the demographics of these schools. The smallest school I looked at was the small private university, and then the largest school was the large state. The community college, not surprisingly, is the most affordable of these options, and the prestigious private, the most pricey. And then here's some demographic information as well, because I was asking them questions about that type of information. So first, what I did before I even reached out to anyone at these schools, I looked at institutional websites and gathered what I could about their programs from those. And from then, I reached out to someone from each school and met with them and did about a 20 to 40-minute interview. It really ranged. And I wrote down all of what they said to me and analyzed it. And this is what I came up with through my analysis. So once I transcribed everything, I really wrote everything down and really looked into it to try to find patterns or similarities and differences in what they said. And I found, I would say about 90 to 95% of what every single person said in all of my interviews fit into one of these 3 categories up here. So they all fit into either accommodation and student focused, community and belonging focused, or information and preparedness focused. So with the accommodation and student focused, what they typically said are key words in this category was really accommodation, individualization, personalization, student needs, and meeting students where they're at. In the community and belonging focused category, this category has a lot to do with belonging and family. So you'll sometimes hear colleges say, this is like a big family here. Connectivity, involvement, community, like joining clubs and programs to really get involved in a school. And student leaders and seminar professors or involved faculty and staff, this is where the other people come in. So a lot of programs really depend on other people supporting and helping those first year students. And then lastly, students missing experiences. And then for the information and preparedness category, this really has to do with students getting information they need to succeed. So like resources, transition, preparedness, and avoiding information overload or avoiding overwhelming students. So now I'm going to talk about what I really found in these interviews and relevant to each of these categories and how each of these schools approach their first year experience program. So for the community college, accommodation and student-focused material was a really big goal for them. And one thing that the interviewee mentioned that really made me really think about it is they said that the typical university's non-traditional student is their traditional student. So for them, accommodating is super, super important because there's a lot of variety in what types of students there are. They mentioned some students don't have a car, so they have to do everything online, while other students don't have Wi-Fi, so they can't do anything online. So accommodating for every single student they have was a really, really important goal for them. And that's something they really focus on. And for the affluent private and community college, they mentioned some of the best things about their program fall into this category, which I think was an interesting group of two schools that mentioned this being the thing they're best at. But with the affluent private, something they really, really focus on and strive on is allowing their students to have individualized curriculum and personalized programming. And so they put a lot of their resources specifically with those two things. So they really account for the accommodation and student focused aspect of a program. And lastly, the small private school did not mention this category at all when discussing how they accommodate for size, diversity, and type, which I thought was interesting because all 5 of the other schools mentioned something in this category when discussing the size, diversity, and type and how they account for that with their institution. And so for our second category, the community and belonging focused. So 3 out of the 6 schools had part of this category as their goal. And I really want to emphasize the large state school here because this school really, really loved talking about belonging and emphasizing belonging. And I really think that comes to the fact that the school does have 20,000 students. So when you have that many, it becomes a focus to try to bring that community and belonging because they don't want their students to feel like 1 out of 20,000. They want to feel like part of this group. So they really focus on that here to allow for students to feel like they're part of a group, which it might be easier for some of the smaller institutions to create that feel. The large state school and HBCU mentioned this category when discussing how they accommodate for size, type, and diversity. I thought this was really interesting because these schools emphasized the identity they wanted to create in their students in reference to the school, specifically the HBCU. They wanted their students to be proud of the school that they're at. So they really emphasize this belonging and community focused aspect of it. And the community college was the only school that did not mention this category when discussing the best things about their program, which when you think about it is not surprising because this is a school that is encouraging students to move on. They're not encouraging students to savor the time they have there. A lot of students transfer to a 4-year university where they finish their schooling or go to a job. So a lot of people here aren't looking for a community or belonging. And a majority of students here are also part-time students. So it's really hard for them to accommodate for that as well. But since they were the only one who did not, all the other schools in this category mentioned how other students or faculty and staff members were one of the best things about their program. So every single other school emphasized that and basically said they could not do it without the support of other people. So seminar professors was something that was mentioned a lot. The professors who really invest in students when they show up here, 18 years old, having no clue. Also, students who stay at schools over the summer was something that was also talked about a lot for most of the schools and how they really influence these young lives that are coming into the school. So that was something that it really didn't surprise me, but every school emphasized it so much that emphasizing it surprised me. And the small private school emphasized this was something the program needs to work on. And they said that in the past couple of years, they've had a lot of professors who are really, really invested retire, and they've noticed how that has impacted the program. So through that, you can really see how invested people kind of make or break certain programs here. And lastly, our information and preparedness focused category. So 3 out of the 6 schools had goals within this category. The small private, HBCU, and prestigious private. all had goals with this category, as well as discussed this category in reference to accommodating for size, type, and demographics. So this was something the prestigious private school was very invested in. They were really, really proud of the fact that they really help students avoid information overload while getting the information they need across. So this was something the prestigious private school talked about a lot. The community college and prestigious private mentioned this theme when talking about the best aspects of their program, which again, I think is an interesting pairing for the two schools here. But like I mentioned, the prestigious private mentioned really making sure students get what they need, but not anything more than that. And the community college here really is proud that every single student gets the same information, despite all the students having the difficulties that some community college students have. And the HBCU mentioned wanting to work more in this category. So a specific problem that the HBCU interviewee mentioned was that they had some really competitive programs at their school, and students came in wanting to do those programs and didn't realize getting accepted into the school did not mean getting accepted into that competitive program. So the interviewee was really struggling to find a way to convey that information in a way that made sense without like completely overloading the student and having their brain shut down and not pay attention at all. So that's a really specific example of how the information and preparedness category really makes a difference. And something else I thought was very interesting, the affluent private school and large state school mentioned nothing involving this category. So all the other categories, all the schools said at least something little, or only one school was left out. But for this one, nothing was ever mentioned from these two schools, which I thought was an interesting thing to take note of. And lastly, one of my research questions was about evaluation and how people evaluate their first year experience programs, and what does a successful one even mean? Like, how do you determine that? So I asked all the interviewees, do you think this program is effective in comparison to the college's goal that I asked them in one of the earlier questions? So I had 4 schools give a definite yes to that. The small private school, large state, HBCU, and the affluent private school all gave a definitive yes. But I was surprised that 2 schools didn't give a direct yes to that question. I was kind of expecting everyone to just say, yes, our program's great. So I really appreciated that they like really talked me through it. The community college said the program helps them work towards their goal, which I thought was interesting. They really depend on a lot of other aspects within the school to help support them through that. And that's something they're always really working on. And the prestigious private school, surprisingly enough, said yes for now. This interviewee was very forward thinking about the future. They talked about wanting to hire more people and growing the office. So they really hesitated to just give a direct yes when answering this question. Another thing I asked the interviewees was about retention numbers, because a lot of first year experience is about like helping students and helping them gain that confidence and transitioning into school. But I think retention is something that all schools are thinking about, and it is a major aspect of first year experience. Schools want students to stay there. They want students to thrive there and get their education. So these numbers, I literally just asked all the interviewees what they could tell me about retention numbers, and they gave me these numbers. So this is a qualitative study. I just asked them and then put in what they told me. So that's how I got these percentages. It's not a quantitative study that deals a lot with numbers. So this is just what I have. I put the full-time and part-time on the community college section because all the other numbers are for full-time students, but the community college did have more part-time students than full-time students. So I felt like I should include both here. And another thing the community college interviewees really wanted me to think about when giving me these numbers is that does this mean the same thing for a community college as it would with other four-year institutions? And the answer is no. A lot of students do 1 year at a community college and then transfer to a university, but that number is still impacted in the retention rates. So for them, sometimes it's a good thing if students transfer, but you'll also have the occasional student drop out and things like that. Another thing the interviewee mentioned from the community college is that students, they accept everyone. So they do not deny anyone at all unless it's for like a legal reason. So with that, you're gonna have way more students who might not complete the program that they go into. Other schools are more restrictive. If they think a student potentially might drop out, they might not admit them, but the community college really opens that for everybody. Another thing I wanted to mention with these numbers is the prestigious private school was one of the ones that did not give a definite yes for the effectiveness, but they do have the highest retention rate out of all of them. And I really think that comes down to the type of school that it is. Being a prestigious institution means they might look at these numbers a little bit differently than other institutions would. And another thing I wanted to mention about these numbers is the affluent private school was the only school that emphasized retention when talking about how they evaluated their own program. A lot of other schools really mentioned surveys and direct feedback or 360 evaluations. This school, they said the only thing they care about was the retention numbers. And you can kind of see that in their numbers. They have the second best out of all of them. So I thought these were interesting. So in conclusion, what does this all mean for each institution? How does this answer my research questions? Here, I really wanted to look at each school individually instead of each category individually, and that might give more insight or make it seem more cohesive. So the small private school focused a lot on information, belonging, but not accommodation. The large state school focused a lot on accommodation and belonging, but not information. And the same thing can be said for the affluent private institution. The community college focused on accommodation, information, and not belonging, while the HBCU and prestigious private focused on all three categories. And I think instinctually, I want to say all three categories should be focused on for all institutions. They're all really important and all create a great cohesive program. And I think for the most part, that is true. But when you look at outliers like the community college, them focusing not on the belonging section of it makes a lot of sense. I kind of mentioned this earlier when I was talking about the individual categories. They aren't focusing on that because they don't need to, and that's not really the purpose of the institution. And when we're looking at the two schools, the large state and affluent private that don't focus on information, through their interviews, you can kind of see why they don't focus on that. Since the large state school focuses so much on belonging and emphasizes community and allowing the students to have a comfortable space, they expect their students to ask questions and then be given the information they need or the resources they need. So they have their staff and professional people having that information rather than just giving it to the students and allowing students to have that really comfortable space to ask about it. So then you don't necessarily need to have like all the information given to them at once or even worry about information overload in that regard. And that's something that these two schools really emphasize and kind of have completely developed. So I think through this, you can really see all three of these categories are extremely important. It really just also does depend on the school and how their first year experience program functions as a whole. And it really is hard to completely say what works and doesn't work, but these are kind of the main things I've gleaned from this project. So on that note, do you guys have any questions? Yes, Polly.
You may have said this in the beginning. How are you defining accommodation?
So this is
Category?
really, yeah, I can go back to it. So the accommodation and student focus category, accommodation is really taking each individual student and accommodating for their specific needs. So something really in this category is individualization, personalization, and student needs are really key for that one.
Okay, got it. Thanks.
How do we distinguish affluent from?
Question.
Yeah, that is a good question. Basically the overall price of the institution. So over here, I did include their tuition numbers. Their tuition numbers is lower than the prestigious institution, But when calculating the overall amount of money for like textbook or living on campus and the percentage of students who live on campus versus off and how much that costs, it was a lot higher than the other institutions. So that is why I labeled them that, but that is also just the label I used, so I didn't have to say the institution's name. Yes, Nick.
You mentioned that the affluent private institution was very focused on its retention numbers. And so I wonder if there's any positive or negative consequences from being so focused on retention? Anything that you might have noticed?
I feel like it's just kind of how they do it. There weren't any definitive negatives that like came out to me, because they're so focused on retention and they know that students need to feel a certain connection to the institution. They know students need to feel like they're wanted here. They know students need these positive things to stay at the institution. It's not necessarily negative for the students or from the student's perspective. They just really emphasize that those things are needed for attention. So they do all of these positive things for that. It's kind of how they framed it. Yes.
Rachel, you talked about the different ways these institutions approach these programs.
Mm-hmm.
I wanted to know if you also noticed that it's not just that they do it in different ways, but that some of them do it more than others, or think that it's like a bigger deal that we pay more attention to it than others would.
Yeah, there is definitely a difference. So, kind of our outlier here is the community college, and for them, their program is structured so differently that their emphasis is on completely different things. Their emphasis is really on first advising and building those class schedules and a lot of the information and preparedness category. So in that regards, it seems like it does less than other institutions, but their focus is just on something different. I will say, surprisingly, the prestigious private institution did seem like they had less of a cohesive program than some of the other ones. And the interviewee mentioned that their program was, I want to say, about 5 years old. I don't remember the exact number, but I remember it being a lower number than many of the other institutions. So before the first year experience program was created at that school, all the departments kind of came together to create kind of a mashup first year experience. So at this school, it's still a lot of the other departments do a lot, and first year experience is still smaller. So there is a range in that for sure. Yes.
Just a quick observation. All the categories you have, African Americans are mentioned, except prestigious.
Yes, that is because the number was lower than 5%, so I didn't put it in there. Yeah. Yeah.
Well, two comments kind of, but the second one's kind of a question.
Yeah.
Well, first of all, based on what you were saying about the origins of first year programs, well, it sounds like schools have these, oh yeah, it's about retention, it's about this, it's really about keeping students under control. I'm just, they're attacking the president, so I'm just that's a little bit. I mean, we should question, right? We should question. But the other thing that a question that came to my mind is, of course, you're interviewing people who are involved in delivering the first year program. It would be interesting, I think, to interview students, and it would only extend your project by 2 or 3 years.
Yeah.
But it would be interesting what what students' responses to that. Those different in what they think of it. And that's not to say that the students would necessarily be, they're the ones that would be right. It'd just be an interesting perspective.
Yeah. I agree. Yep.
Did you see a connection between retention and
the motivation for retention in particular schools. For example, what I mean is like retention for some schools might be that they survive because they need students to stay there. Others might say, we want to retain students because it's good for them and it's a benefit for them to have this degree and to hold on to their time at college and not to fall behind, right? So there's this, is there a connection between the motivation and the size of the institution? Did you see anything like that, or is it? I'm just making it up out of.
Yeah, so I think that really goes back to the only school that really had too much to say about retention before I asked about it was the affluent private school. And with them, you can see they have 82% retention rate, one of the higher ones. So I think because they're focusing on that, it does get bumped up, but I think specifically the HBCU mentioned a lot about really helping their students, and that's what they want to do. One thing that school mentioned that none of the other schools did mention was how they really want to help their students with social mobility. And that was never used in any of the other interviews I did. And the HBCU interviewee mentioned a lot about how some of their tactics may seem a little, she used the word forceful, but in like a friendly way. They like literally go to students and be like, hey, why aren't you emailing me back? Hey, why didn't you text me back? Hey, why didn't you go to class? And that I think that really did come from a place of wanting to help them. But through that, I think their retention numbers are one of the higher ones. So I think that also helps with that, but there's not like really a direct correlation at face value. Yes.
Because I have more of a comment, it's actually related to what you asked her, because this would be one of the reading through the lines, trying to tease out some of that information, because the affluent private has a price tag not far off from the prestigious private, but the prestigious private competes in the Ivy League, right? Because I know what schools are, but the affluent private does not. So there's got to be some justification for that dollar, right? So there's some of that pressure on these programming offices to support that. Right? So that's definitely in her transcripts. You can kind of see that, but that would be a different study in of itself, which you can do later.
Yeah, going off that, one of the things about the prestigious private institutions, one of the reasons that the interviewee didn't really think it was as successful as they wanted is because a lot of their students do their first year and then apply for their dream school again and get accepted into a quote unquote an Ivy basically, and then transfer there. So with them, their retention isn't necessarily students dropping out or not doing school. It's going to a different higher level institution, which is what some schools don't have to worry about at all. Yes.
So do you notice, in regard to retention and athletics, these various campuses?
I think the only school that mentioned athletics at all was the small private institution here, and with that one, there was actually a bit of a competition, or not really competition, but conflict between sports and the program. So the interviewee mentioned wanting to do a lot of programming, but a lot of the student athletes weren't able to attend. And so even if something was mandatory, only like half the students would show up, was something they said. So it has really put, in that specific instance, a damper on the school from the interviewee's perspective. Yes.
I'm curious about COVID. COVID is spreading among you mentioned a lot of things in higher ed.
Yeah, correct.
Did any of your interviewees mention COVID and how it's changed anything about their programs?
Yeah, so that was, thank you for bringing that up. That was something I meant to talk about when I was talking about these numbers. So for my specific study, I really didn't want to focus on COVID because that would be a whole different study about how it affects higher education. So these numbers here, most of them are from the 2018-2019 school year, but some of the schools mentioned how COVID affected them. So the affluent private said that COVID did not affect them at all. Their retention numbers stayed the exact same throughout, which I thought was really interesting. And something they said was that they stayed in person throughout that whole time period. So that was something they said kind of perceiving it as a benefit because no students really changed. The HBCU mentioned a slight dip in retention, but only by a couple of percentage points. And none of the other ones really mentioned it, but that's really because I told them that's not what my study was, so. Yes.
Do you think the presence and prevalence of Greek life on any of these, at any of these institutions kind of is relevant for your study or factors in?
I'm sure it does factor in, but none of the institutions mentioned Greek life. The HBCU mentioned it kind of as like a side note. One thing they really focus on is having people in the first year experience department know all the options for students to get involved in, and connecting with all of those is something they really emphasize. But other than that, none of the other schools mentioned Greek life as part of my study, but I'm sure it does have some sort of factor. I'm just not sure what that would be. Yes.
Sorry, I have to do this. We actually have to move.
Okay, yeah.
Because we're running out of time, but keep your questions. We're gonna have refreshments afterwards and you can definitely keep asking. Great job, Rachel.
Thank you.